Good day. My name is Travis Bembenek. I'm the owner and CEO of Mexico News Daily. I'm joined with my friend George Revis. Good day, George.
Buenos dias, Travis.
Good day. Today's episode of Confidently Wrong is going to be about banking in Mexico. Now, you'd think banking in Mexico generally isn't a super interesting topic, but the reality is it's been in the news a lot lately, and a lot of people are talking about it. And there's a lot of concern. I mean, on Mexico News Daily's site, we get a ton of questions and concern and interest in any topic on banking recently. So with that said, George, why is that? Can you just give us a little bit of the introduction on why it's in the news all of a sudden?
You know, back in June, the U.S. government came out, FinCEN and the U.S. Treasury Department came out and imposed sanctions on three Mexican banks, CIBanco, Intercam, and Vector. And they basically accused those banks of laundering money. So they imposed sanctions. The sanctions were actually never put in place. But they did put a deadline on it when they were going to, put the sanctions in place. But sort of the damage was already done just by the announcement, because it meant that all U.S. banks then stopped sending money from the U.S. to those three Mexican banks. And those three Mexican banks, CIBanco, Intercam, and Vector, happened to be three banks that most expats use, or a ton of expats use. So
I mean, I'll be honest, I got caught up in it as well. So, when I moved to Mexico years ago, I didn't have a bank here. And some expat friends told me, use CIBanco, they're great, they're easy. So I didn't shop around, I didn't analyze. I went to my local CIBanco, opened an account, and it's been fine up until a couple months ago.
Right. And, so then a ton of people who had accounts like you at those banks were sort of caught off guard, and they were no longer allowed to send money from the U.S. to their Mexican banks. So they were just basically cut off. And, that created obviously tons of problems for a ton of people, and everybody was left scrambling trying to find another option.
It's interesting because I mean, I'll be honest, I got caught being very confidently wrong on this topic. The announcement was made that there would be sanctions placed, and as a result, U.S. banks wouldn't be able to send money, like you said. And I looked at my own personal situation, and I said, okay, I don't need to send any money anytime soon. I can wait a couple months. I can still use my ATM card and use my bank locally. So I didn't do anything. I actually went to the bank and I said, maybe this sounds naive, but I said, look, when do you think this is going to get cleared up? And they gave me a very specific date. It was like September 12th is when they expect this issue to be resolved. And so I didn't do anything.
Right. Well, and needless
Feel free
to say,
to call me an idiot here if you'd like to, but please don't.
Needless to say, those issues didn't get resolved. And ultimately, both of those banks ended up basically shutting their doors, right? The Mexican government did end up revoking CIBanco's banking license. But what's important for people to understand, too, though, is the banks didn't necessarily collapse, right? This wasn't like a run on the bank or a failure of the Mexican banking system. It wasn't that at all. It was the U.S. imposed sanctions on these banks and basically had them in a noose, and that sort of forced what happened with basically the closure or the buyout of these banks. But
I think, if I can stop you, I think that's precisely why I was confidently wrong, right? I thought, okay, this was sort of kicked off by the United States. I thought this could be a tariff negotiating strategy, just putting pressure in a lot of different places, including a couple banks.
Well, I think it was.
Yeah, I thought it was, and it felt like that, and then it went from just sort of this where I couldn't send money to, 2 weeks ago, literally getting an email from the Mexican government, the banking institution or whatever, saying, your account at CIBanco is frozen. You cannot touch it. But don't worry, as long as you have something like 3 million pesos or less, which I do, they said you just have to open a new bank account and you'll be fine. So any thoughts on that, or have you
Explain
heard?
that. Yeah, explain that a little bit, Travis, because when you say my account was frozen, that sounds scary. But it was basically just, we're going to be shutting down CIBanco. They're losing their banking license, but your funds are safe. When you open
Yep.
up a new bank account, here is the process that you are going to go through with, whatever, CIBanco to move then that I don't want to say frozen, but move those assets from CIBanco into your new bank account. And, so it's not like people were going to lose their money. Is it a pain in the ass?
But people
Sure.
felt that way, right? I think we as Americans immediately think of the bank runs, of the stock market crashes, or of the depression. Immediately in my head, I started trying to remember what that FDIC sign on every bank door said that the account was insured up to. You kind of freak out a little bit, even though the government was very clear in saying, you're fine. You have a year to make this transition. But in the meantime, I would go on my CIBanco account and I would get the message from the Mexican government. I couldn't even see my accounts. So I think what you said is important, that this wasn't like a structural failure that could have a domino effect in the Mexican
Exactly.
banking system. This was a different kind of situation.
No, 100%. And you bring up a good point about the U.S. having the FDIC, and Mexico has something similar. I mean, those deposits are insured up to certain amounts. I guess based on what you said, the government said up to 3 million pesos. So it's not like those funds are just going to vanish, and they gave you pretty much a sort of a clear path of how to move those funds out of your CIBanco account. Yeah, it's going to be a little bit of a pain, but everything did end up being fine. With
Well, and I can
Intercam-
actually update my little telenovela here, because when I got this email from the Mexican government and word that my account was no longer accessible, to not use the word frozen, I was visiting family and friends in the United States. So I actually said, the day I get back, I'm going to get on this. I'm going to evaluate banking options. I'm going to open a new bank account. And I'm going to get the money moved over from CIBanco. And I'm happy to report that literally from choosing a bank that I wanted to open a new account with till the money moved over, all of it in entirety, to my new bank account from CIBanco was less than 4 days. So
Wow, that's A, amazing, and B, you're the first person I've talked to who's actually gone through that
it
process.
was
And
absolutely simple. I mean,
Right.
stressful, scary, constantly telling my wife, trust me, even though I had clearly been wrong up until that point. But I mean, the bank account opening was harder. The lady, and I think it's important to point out, George and I are in no way advocating or lobbying or in any way, pushing for one bank or another. We're just sharing what we know, what we've heard, what we've personally experienced. But I opened an account in Actinver. I evaluated a couple different banks. Actinver was user friendly, good service. I liked the vibe. And it was interesting. She told me the process for opening a bank account has gotten more complicated as of late. But that being said, it was quick. She actually helped me, or the bank helped me with that process of sort of formally asking for my money from CIBanco, and it came right away. I mean, super fast. So
Well,
that's important.
Travis, let's talk about sort of the requirements to open a Mexican bank account, because a lot of people sort of don't know what those requirements are. And, to open a bank account first, you need to have either your temporary or permanent residency.
Right.
And then you also need an RFC number. And this is for most banks.
Yeah,
Like
not all of
sometimes you
them.
Right. Sometimes you can get around it, but most banks, it's funny because CIBanco and Intercam were two of the banks that had the most lenient rules as far as opening up an account, and you didn't actually need your RFC number to open up or your temporary or permanent residency. And that's why a lot of expats or, immigrants, flocked to those banks because the rules, it was just easier. And a lot of people didn't have that RFC number. But in general, that's getting more difficult, as you mentioned, but in general, you need your temporary permanent residency and your RFC number. Your RFC number is basically the equivalent of a tax ID number in the States. And you have to get it from the SAT office. SAT is the equivalent of the IRS. But once you have your RFC number, you can go into basically any bank and open an account. You usually need like proof of address, so your CFE bill or a lease agreement that shows you're renting somewhere or something like that. But those are the requirements.
George, when I came back from the U.S. on just a week out and got on this, I just started visiting some of my local banks because I hadn't done my homework. I hadn't researched, the pros and cons. And I was surprised at how different the sort of the requirements, but also just the feel of what it would be like banking with each of the banks were. So I'll give you an example. One of the banks, and it was a big one, said the only way they would allow me to open an account was if I got a 1-year car insurance with them. I had to get a year of car insurance with this bank, and it was a very reputable bank.
Let's talk about that. Let's talk about that. And that's on my list of things. So I'm not sure which bank that was, but that is, a pretty typical, and I'm going to go ahead and say it, scam that the Mexican banks do. At BBVA, they will tell you that you have to sign up for like a life's insurance savings plan or something. And they tell you it's mandatory, just like that other bank told you, and that in order to open up your account, you have to buy this life insurance savings plan. Well, the fact is you don't have to do that. And the teller gets a commission off of selling you that savings plan or whatever. So the teller says, yeah, you have to do it to force you, to open the account so that they get their commission.
Just a point on that, George. It wasn't even the teller. I mean, this was like one of the people in the cubicles, right? I mean, one of the offices. So this was, but to your point, it was like the salesperson. But they told me that was non-negotiable. And I said, but a ton of expats don't have cars. And they said, then they can't bank with us.
Well, and then you leave the branch and then you call their customer service line and you say, hey, they forced me to do this. I did not want it. And they will remove it from your account. So I'm not sure which bank you went to that said that, but I do know that at BBVA, they tell you have to have it. In fact, you do not have to have it. But just for ease, go in and say, fine, I'll get it, and then walk out, call their customer service number, and, they'll remove it from your account. You don't have to pay anything.
That's incredible.
But it sort of sucks, too, that, it's the first time you're dealing with a specific bank, and you walk in, and your first experience is they're, like, trying to rip you off, right?
That's what I was getting at. I mean, they were not all the same. I walked out of some feeling like I needed to shower or angry. Another bank told me that I could make wire transfers from the United States into my new account immediately. But if I had some cash, I could not make any cash deposits for 6 months. And I said, what if I have $1,000 in US dollars and I need to deposit it into my account? They said, for 6 months, you can't, which just seems very strange to me.
I've never heard that one. But I do want to say this, though, that, we're talking about these negative first experiences, but once your account is open, right, the banking system in Mexico and the banking infrastructure, in my opinion, is light years ahead of the U.S., even Canada, and once you get through that horrible experience potentially opening it, when you deal with the apps and the platforms and what you can do on the apps and the platforms, I think the Mexican banking system is actually fantastic.
Let me play devil's advocate to that a minute. So what if one of our listeners says, look, I spend 6 months a year in Mexico, and I'll just use my credit cards and my US ATM card where I can go to any debit card machine and just take out money, why would I even want to mess with a Mexican banking account based on what I'm hearing from you guys? What would you say to that?
Well, if you spend that much time here, or if you own property here, or, whatever, work here, anything like that, I think you definitely do need a Mexican bank account. For a ton of reasons. Sure, you can use your US ATM card, go get cash, whatever, but when, if you own property and you've got to pay your CFE bill, or you've got to pay your Telmex bill or Total Play bill, that's very difficult to do without a Mexican bank account. Or maybe you go in and pay it at OXXO and wait in a 20-person line and, bring your bill in and they scan it and you can pay it there. But, having, a Mexican bank account makes life much easier here.
For sure.
Sometimes you may have to pay your employees and maybe you're not in Mexico. Like, let's say you have a house manager and you're in Canada for 6 months, and how are you going to pay that house manager without your Mexican bank account? And these Mexican accounts and the apps, they make it super easy to pay people or pay bills through the apps. Super easy, through a transferencia, and you can send money in seconds to anybody's, like if you have their debit card number, if you have their phone number in a lot of cases, or their clave, and you can send the money in seconds.
I think it's a little foreign to, Americans and Canadians, where many people, it's not crazy to see someone writing a check in a grocery store in the US.
Yeah, that's insane.
Still.
That would never happen. Would never happen in Mexico.
And exactly. And I think a lot of Americans as well think, well, look, when I travel internationally and go on vacation, I just use my credit card and my debit card. So what if I'm, on vacation for 6 months in Mexico? Why is it any different? And to your point, I mean, if you look closely, if you're on vacation for a week, you get burned by the credit card fees and the bad exchange rates and everything, but it's a week. If you really dig deep into those fees have gotten higher and higher. Those exchange rate, differentials between reality and what you get are worse and worse. And so
that adds up over 6 months.
It significantly adds up. And so unless you just really have enough money that you don't want to you don't care about those things, it really is smart, from a financial perspective to have a bank where you can take advantage of better exchange rates, and even, as George said, pay people that you're going to need to pay here. And you may think, well, I don't need to. But if you're here for those couple months and you see a really cool piece of art that you want to buy, you can buy it with your credit card, but you're going to be probably losing, 5 to 10% on exchange rate and fees. And you could pay with your local bank account in Mexico and pay nothing, basically.
And pay it instantly and pay it simply.
Yes.
That's why, because the Mexican banking system and infrastructure is so good, that's why things like Venmo or PayPal, Mexicans don't need to use that. Sure, people do use PayPal sometimes, but they don't need Venmo because they can just go into their bank app and they can send their friend or whomever money in literally like 2 seconds, and it arrives without having to use a third party, company or app. So
I think it's interesting. You mentioned it briefly, George. If you ever go to an OXXO and you just want to buy a Coke or something, or a donut or something, and there's like 5 people in line, and each transaction seems to take 5 minutes, and you're like, what is going on here? And it's because people literally go in and pay their bills for the month at the gas station, at the little OXXO. And they just, you see them and they're reading their numbers of where they need to pay. And in a couple minutes, they've done all their payments for the month. So that's what you're seeing when you're in OXXO.
And I'd like to encourage all those people to get bank accounts so that when we go to OXXO, we don't have to wait in line of 20
No
people.
kidding. My number one OXXO pet peeve is they need to have a line for people just wanting to buy stuff and another line for people wanting to do their banking.
Totally.
So George, let's just back up just for 1 minute because, there's national Mexican banks, there's Spanish banks. There's CIBanco, which has, some relationship or had or is changing with Citibank. There's regional banks. I mean, what do you, any words of wisdom on your experience just on where to even begin with the massive list of options?
I prefer bigger banks, mainly for the reason that, a couple of the biggest banks here, BBVA, they're a Spanish bank, but they're the largest bank in Latin America. Or Banorte is a Mexican, it's one of the, I think, the largest Mexican-owned bank. But I just like bigger banks, mainly because they feel safer to me, and also because the bigger the bank, the more ATMs they have, the more locations they have, the more branches they have. So, if you have a little local bank, maybe that's great where you live, but then you travel to Mexico City and you can't find an ATM or you can't find a branch. Banks like BBVA, Banorte, even Santander, HSBC, they've got branches all over the place. So I like those bigger banks. I also like the bigger banks because to me, it seems like they sort of have more resources to plow into their apps and their platform,
Sure.
And I think BBVA and Banorte have two of the best banking apps and platforms in Mexico. And for me, because, and this is just personally, but for me, because I only use my banking app and the platform, I never go into a branch. So the app and the platform are super important to me because I do all of my banking through the app and platform.
So that's interesting that you brought that up because, in my search here, I went to some of these big ones. And again, I don't want to name names because I don't want to pick on somebody and everybody's experience is different. But my experience, my initial sort of feeling at those banks, I didn't like. I really didn't like the experience. And I got to say at CIBanco, and it's not a language thing, but they all spoke English. And it felt like to me like they got what expats needed. They knew, and that's one thing that I liked about Actinver. They seemed to have a focus on the expats' needs, right? And so some of these other big banks are doing, they're dealing with Mexican individual accounts, Mexican corporate accounts, and I'm sure, expats are a small portion of their business. And so that's something to think about too. For me, a lot of it was being able to walk to a place in town here in San Miguel where I could just deal with people, people that sort of understood my needs. And I didn't feel that in some of these big bank initial screening processes.
Yeah, that's a good point. The other thing I would say is, I have several bank accounts. I don't have very much money in them, unfortunately, but I have several. And, I think Actinver is good, but I wouldn't want them as my primary sort of bank. But I think, sure, there's a benefit to having an account there for whatever reasons. But I also think it helps to have an account at BBVA or Banorte.
Sure.
And you don't have to be limited to one account because some might be better than the others. Now there's all these sort of digital banks, right? Nubank is a good example of them. I think they're out of Brazil. They basically just got their banking license in Mexico, but it's all online. And I set up an account there just because you didn't have to go in. And I just wanted to test it out because it's, part of my job. And there are several other sort of digital options out there too, where you don't even have to go into the bank to open the account. But, I would encourage people, not to get discouraged if they feel slimy when they open the account, because don't worry, you never have to go back in that branch ever again if you don't want, and you can do everything online. So does it really
I think
matter?
a lot of people though aren't. I mean, you are, George, clearly comfortable in an all online banking world, but most people aren't. I mean, I'm pretty old school as well. That I like to walk in and have a person that I can talk to, and so I think, I guess let's try to wrap it up, George. I think, let's just say, I think people don't have to be afraid, but
Totally.
as has been a similar theme in a lot of our episodes. You got to get informed. You got to get educated. Go to multiple banks, ask the same questions at each one, and just get a feel for which ones give you the answers that make you feel comfortable.
Well, I think it goes beyond just don't be afraid. I think it goes to once you actually open an account at, say, BBVA, Santander, Banorte, whatever, and you get used to the app, I think you will quickly realize how great the Mexican banking system is, and the tools and the apps. And I think you'll be very pleasantly surprised.
So you'd put it in the category of it's all part of the experience of going and moving to another country, being open-minded, trying to learn, and you'd put banking in that category as well. Different, but you can learn, and it might even be better.
I'm going to say different and definitely better. My humble opinion.
That's a good place to end. Well, thank you, George. Thanks for your time, and we'll talk again soon.
All right. Thanks, Travis.
Take care.